Hello my friends, this is Indypride from Milk and Cookies Total War, and today I'm going to talk about a topic that some might consider taboo, but is without a doubt an omnipresent force in Warhammer. Sex and sexuality are, believe it or not, an important part of the Warhammer fantasy world. You could certainly make the argument that it's an even more important part of 40k lore, simply because of the galactic scale of that universe. The Fall of the Eldar and the birth of She Who Thirsts are certainly great examples of that. But this video will discuss its importance in Warhammer Fantasy and the implications it could have for races introduced in Total War Warhammer. First things first, what are the purposes of sex in the context of the Warhammer world? Well, procreation is the most obvious. Obviously, races have to procreate to prevent extinction, and extinction is an ever-looming possibility for the people of the Warhammer world. When the Dark Gods are sending their most evil and powerful creations at you in waves, attempting to tear down the very fabric of your civilization, you will fight back as a race, and in the process, lose manpower in the war and the bloodshed that follows. To combat these losses, sex happens, whether in direct response or simply because it's an instinct living beings are drawn towards. Humans have sex, elves have sex, dwarves have sex, and then there are, of course, lizard men who spawn from spawning pools and greenskins who grow from a fungus, so they don't really fall into the equation. But some races, like the High Elves, are dwindling in large part due to the fact that they take such a long time to reach sexual maturity, and thus procreate very, very slowly. Theoretically, the Azur are losing elf power at a much faster rate than they can replenish their population, although in practice, there are always just enough elves for the purposes of the fluff. But more than a way to procreate, sex and sexuality are used as weapons in Warhammer. This is an unfortunate truth in warfare, that during times of armed conflict, rape is frequently used as a means of psychological warfare in order to humiliate an enemy, and release the passions that were inflamed during the bloodletting. Let me be clear, sexual violence in any form is completely abhorrent and disgusting, and I condemn it with every core of my being. But remember that this is also a fantasy world we're talking about currently, not a real one, so let's just keep that in mind and get that out of the way. Warhammer is perhaps unique in this respect, though, in that sexual violence is perpetrated at least as often, if not more frequently, on men than on women. And the reason for that is that these atrocities occur on the battlefield, far away from the home front, and the Empire, High Elves, and other factions of Order quite rarely have their incredibly powerful walled cities sacked in the lore. As males predominate the battlefield in Warhammer, although there are of course plenty of exceptions, they are more likely to be toyed with by Slaaneshi demons and the other monsters that inhabit this grimdark fantasy universe. There are entire races in Warhammer in which seduction and sexual violence are pervasive and core tenets of their culture. If you're familiar with Warhammer lore, you will know of whom I speak. The Dark Elves of Naggaroth and the Cultists of Slaanesh are two races which fall into this category, and these things are used to devastating psychological effect when these factions march to war. For example, Slaanesh is the chaos god of twisted pleasure, debauchery, and enduring agony. Although Slaanesh is called the Dark Prince, in reality it is neither male or female, but rather can take or give any form, sometimes an androgynous form combining features and characteristics from both male and female, sometimes appearing as an impossibly beautiful woman or incredibly attractive man, sometimes gifting these boons to its devout cultists. One of the crazy things about the Prince of Pleasure and its followers is that oftentimes they are horrific and grotesque to look upon, mutated with floppy appendages and unnatural body parts, but they're still somehow incredibly alluring, able to seduce beings with strong willpower and reduce warrior priests to tears. Slaanesh is fueled and grows in power when the races of Warhammer overindulge in anything considered pleasurable. And although pleasure is indeed a very broad term that can encompass anything from eating and drinking to sadism and masochism, or even something as simple as desiring companionship or coveting your neighbor's possessions, the very aesthetic of Slaaneshi followers and the debauchery they sink into make it clear that sex is one of the primary motivations of Slaaneshi followers, as it is a primary motivation of human beings as well. The only difference being, where a regular human might enjoy sex with a person they're attracted to, a cultist of Slaanesh would have sex with that person and all of their family and everyone in that city, and then slowly cut them all up into little itty-bitty pieces and feed them to their demonette friends if they could. Overindulgence in anything, but especially grotesque sexual practices, gives the Dark Prince power. But remember that the ruinous powers are simply a mutated mirror of humanity's own desires for violence, love, companionship, and thirst for knowledge and power. The Dark Elves are similar to Chaos followers of Slaanesh in a lot of ways. In fact, some versions of the lore literally show Witch Elf cults secretly worshipping Slaanesh, and it's absolutely true that the sadism they exhibit as a race directly fuels the power of the Dark Prince, however unintentional that might be. But Dark Elf culture is built on the back of slavery, raiding, pillaging, and extreme sadism. They derive sexual pleasure from inflicting horrific torture on their prey. For example, in the Malice Darkblade series of novels, there's a scene in which the Dark Elf character is telling a human slave that the slave's fiancée, the most beautiful slave girl on the ship, agreed to do whatever Malice asked if her man was set free instead of her. The Dark Elves have a custom of freeing one slave a trip, though Malice could have just been saying that to mess around with him, but the slave is held in place weeping as Malice says how he had his fun with her and then handed over to his officers, who were rougher. Malice describes the blood and the pain she went through and finishes by stating that she no longer wished to sacrifice herself for him and wanted to be freed instead. And then he pulls out a small object. To this point, you're thinking rape, of course, and then you remember that these are Dark Elves and that their favorite hobby is torture, although given their depravity, that unfortunately does not rule out rape, and Malice unfolds the item, which is the girl's skinned and tanned face, and hands it to the slave. "Here," he says, "I saved her pretty face for you. Give her a kiss." Now, this is absolutely traumatizing and horrible, obviously, but this excerpt does a great job of, one, showing off the grimdarkness of Warhammer lore, and two, illustrating the point that the Dark Elves use sexual violence as a horrific psychological weapon. The Witch Elves of Khaine, perhaps better than any other sect of Dark Elf society, demonstrate this point. Clad in very revealing, sensual outfits and sometimes completely naked, the Witch Elves worship the bloody-handed god, the elf lord of murder and war. In a yearly event called Death Night, they flow out of the temples of Khaine into the streets of Harganeth and Nagarand, dragging Dark Elf citizens to be sacrificed in dark rituals. This orgy of blood is followed by orgies of another kind, and it's been theorized that this act is a large reason why the Dark Elves are more numerous than the High Elves, and why they are able to keep their population stable despite the brutal and death-like culture they are a part of. So now that we understand Slaaneshi and Dark Elf culture a bit better, we can discuss what impact these facts will have on Total War Warhammer. My question to you guys is, and I think this is something worthy of discussing, can Creative Assembly do true justice to the Dark Elves and Cultists of Slaanesh in Total War Warhammer with a teen or PEGI 16 rating? A big part of video games, especially a fantasy game like Total War Warhammer, is immersion. It's obviously not real, so being able to completely and totally sink into a game and be whisked away to a different world is an important component. And the games that do this best are usually the ones that are considered truly great by consumers. Knowing what you know about Slaaneshi or Dark Elf culture, can you be fully and truly immersed in a Total War Warhammer campaign with those factions, with these adult aspects dialed back? Without the nakedness and without the Death Knight, without the things that make these cultures so grimdark and grotesque and terrifying. We already have the Blood and Gore pack. It's something that allows CA to get around age ratings and dial things up to 11. For lack of a better phrase, would a tits and ass DLC for Slaanesh and the Dark Elves be something that makes their nature more apparent, and would that benefit the game? To me, it falls exactly into the same category as the Blood and Gore DLC. It's certainly not something that is necessary to enjoy Total War Warhammer, but for those looking to be more immersed in this fantasy world, a $3 DLC that changes models to be more provocative and gives campaign events that are more violent and grimdark and reflective of these races could potentially be a really good thing. I want to be clear that for me, and I'm sure for a lot of you who know Warhammer lore well, this isn't about some sick desire to have horrifying stuff going on in my campaigns. It's really more about immersion and becoming fully engrossed in a universe that I know well. And getting those details right is an important part of that. Without it, I think it's kind of like creating a World War I movie without poison gas, or death by disease, or trench warfare. It's much more difficult to be true to the source material when you're dialing back significantly on the grimdark nature of the Warhammer universe. And at the core of this issue, I think, is a very American ideal, but it's true of a lot of other countries as well, in that as a culture, we don't generally mind exposing our citizens to violence, but when it comes to sex, people have a very different outlook on things. If you look at the news, if you look at movies and media in general, a lot of what we consume is violent and bloody in nature. And as a society, we often don't really seem to have a problem with that. But when it comes to nudity or sexuality, all of a sudden we're much more conservative. I know a lot of families who allow their children to play violent video games but would freak out if their child saw a naked woman, for example. Which I personally find kind of strange, in that sex and nudity are very natural parts of humanity, while violence and murder aren't necessarily. Now, there's certainly a time and place for both in terms of consumption, and I'm certainly not advocating for one or the other. It's up to parents to decide if and when they want to allow their children to watch violent or sexual content. But it's certainly an observation I've made over the years that at least American culture seems fine with violence, but is much more concerned with nudity, while some countries like Germany are the exact opposite. And that mindset will very likely carry over to Total War Warhammer as well, because just by nature of the content, war is very violent, but sex doesn't inherently need to be a part of a Total War game, even if the occasional innuendo has made it into Total War games in the past. So, I kind of expect the Dark Elves and Slaanesh to be dialed back a couple notches in Total War Warhammer in terms of these kind of aesthetics and the way their cultures work. But with that little aside out of the way, let me know what you guys think. Do you think something like that could be good for the game? Do you think a T&A DLC would be important? Would you pay $3 or $5 or a similar price to the Blood Pack for better immersion? Do you even think it's important for a game like Total War Warhammer? Would it even help with your immersion if such a DLC was offered? I'm expecting people will have very different opinions on this matter, so please discuss in the comment section. I read every single comment that gets posted on my channel, and I'm very interested to hear what you guys have to say. Be aware and understanding of the fact that Creative Assembly won't be able to dial up Dark Elf and Slaaneshi culture to 11 in the base game because of their rating. They don't want to mess with that. It's going to be the exact same kind of justification they give for not including Blood and Gore DLC in the beginning. And I think that that justification makes some sense. They want to help the age rating out and sell the game to more people, and divvying up the content this way allows them to keep the rating lower, which ultimately helps them as a business. So again, you don't have to enjoy that business practice, but that is the reason they do it, and I think it's at least somewhat logical. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Be sure to leave a like if you did. Really helps out with the channel, and I will talk to you all soon. Indypride, signing out.